Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 302 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm your host, Danièle Cybulskie. A quick scan of the shelves in the romance section of the bookstore may lead a person to believe that the medieval world was full of spicy romance. And that is absolutely correct. The people of the Middle Ages were no strangers to Cupid's arrows, and just like us, they loved a good love letter. But in a world where literacy rates were far below what they are today, who was writing their most heartfelt feelings down? And how do we know? This week, I spoke with Dr. Myra Stokes and Dr. Ad Putter about medieval love letters. Myra is a former senior lecturer in the English department at the University of Bristol, and the author of books across a range of subjects, including Justice and Mercy in Piers Plowman and The Language of Jane Austen. Ad is professor of English literature and the director of the Centre for Medieval Studies, also at the University of Bristol. He's the author of An Introduction to the Gawain Poet, as well as the co-author of several other books. Together, this dynamic duo edited the works of the Gawain Poet, a subject close to my heart. And speaking of hearts, their new collaboration is Medieval Love Letters, a critical anthology. Our conversation on where we find love letters and the way people wrote and sent them, along with a couple of spicy and hilarious examples, is coming up right after this. Well, thank you to the both of you for coming in and talking to us about medieval love letters. This is so exciting because I think this is the juice that people really want to know about.
Yeah, well, medieval love letters, they were a bit different from modern love letters. And one of the things that really interested us in doing the book is thinking about the way these letters were written, which often involved the use of scribes. You know, we think of love as a deeply personal thing. Of course it is. But in the medieval period, you may have to rely on a scribe to write the letter for you. Then, of course, you need the letter delivered. And in this period, you don't put it in the post with a stamp on it, but you have to have it delivered. And that brings with it all kinds of risks. Mm-hmm. You know, the letter might be intercepted. It's personal. It's secret. Can you trust the person who delivers it? So what you see in these letters is that writers take precautions of various sorts. They may have a little, what they call a token in the letter, or a little thing that both the sender and the addressee will know, but no one else will know, that will therefore help to authenticate the letter. They may add in their own handwriting a little postscript so that the person receiving the letter can actually verify that that is the person. So there are all kinds of ways in which writers negotiate the problems of writing letters in the medieval period, which has its own historical color.
It's so interesting when you think about it, because in some ways you're writing the most personal thing, like you're saying, but it's also almost like a postcard where if you haven't sealed it, or if you're using a scribe or using a reader, everyone knows what your sentiments are.
Yeah, it's personal and private. But the other aspect of the love letter that makes it rather different from writing a personal letter now is that it's also an art form. And Myra and I teach English literature. We teach poetry in an English department, and most of the love letters are in verse. And this is really something that distinguishes the medieval love letter from, I suppose, love letters still get written now, but they're probably unlikely to be written as formal poetry. Well, so that's another thing that makes it quite different.
Well, this was making me think a little bit as I was looking through your book. Everyone's having a discussion about AI right now and whether you can write a letter and is it really you? And I was thinking about maybe you'd hire a scribe and say, like, can you make this sound better than I can make it sound? Like, do you find a scribe that's going to be poetic to make you sound better? Is this something that you think people were doing?
That could go on, yes. Especially if you were really not literate at all, you would go to a scribe and he would, or usually he would suggest ways. And they also did use manuals, model letters. These things were very popular. They weren't simply on love. They covered all occasions you might need. but there was usually a love letter there. And you might just imitate that or adapt it, or sometimes just take it over. And the other thing you could do was use an existing poem. You would simply send that as a kind of Valentine, really, and you might give the messenger some personal message, and then you would simply confirm that the messenger came from you. And he might then say, oh, she's very well and she sent you her love, that kind of thing. But you might use existing poems, and you certainly might use existing letters, or get the scribe, who probably did know model letters. Part of his training would have been in model letter collections and composition. So you could do that. That's less usual, but you can certainly see the influence of models in the letters.
Yes. Well, it reminds me of that moment in A Knight's Tale where they're collectively writing that letter. Do you remember this? And then even still, you have the messenger who's saying, I've also sent you a token, in this case, it's a kiss, which I absolutely love. I love that movie. It seems to be a favorite of medievalists because you have little moments like this.
I quite like the analogy with AI. Not that long ago, I had to do a kind of letter of condolence, and I got AI to suggest me various formulas. I didn't use any of them, but it was fascinating to see that it could. And this is really the situation, I suppose, with these formularies, right? These manuals that give you models and examples. One of my favorites, Boncompagno da Signa, an Italian writer from the 13th century who writes model love letters for all occasions, for men and women.
Yes, yeah. So if you want to proposition a nun, he'll tell you how. And he'll also give her options of saying no politely or saying yes, why not, I'm miserable here. He rather enjoys himself. Yeah. But literally all occasions, yes.
Yes, I absolutely love this source. I think it's called The Wheel of Venus in English, right? And I think two of my favorite examples were how to dissuade a woman from taking the veil. So yes. This is what you're getting at here. And persuading someone to marry for money.
Yes.
This is amazing. Okay, so tell us a little bit about this source. Like, who is this being written for? Do you have a whole community of people that needs to persuade people to not be nuns? What's going on here?
Yeah. Shall I might say worthwhile saying something about this man, Boncompagno da Signa, and what makes him so interesting, because you'll get a sense of the audience from his CV, as it were. He was properly university trained in Bologna and then in Florence, but he really made his fortune, I suppose, popularizing the art of literacy, putting it in the hands of ordinary people. Well, ordinary is in inverted brackets, because the whole thing is, of course, in Latin. It's still for an elite, but it is no longer for an academic elite, not for scholars. It is for you and I. So it's got a much broader appeal, and his language, which Myra savors. Myra absolutely loves his Latin.
It's slightly Italian conversational Latin. Make it up as you go along. His audience may, in fact, have been university students who had a secretarial career in mind, which was a very popular route for young men. They would write letters for people and do their business for them. As a shortcut, you don't need to read Cicero and Virgil. I can make you competent here. And of course, that goes down very well with students. So he was popular with the students, less so with his colleagues, who thought he was a popularizer and a crowd pleaser. And he was. Who actually read these letters? I don't know. It may have been partly a joke.
They were certainly popular, though.
Very popular.
Because this work survives in 8 manuscripts, and we edited it from an early printed edition. So it went into print too. So there were certainly users of the manual. And my favorite is not actually, the two you cite is wonderful, but my favorite is for sure the letter from a woman inviting the lover
to a tryst,
to come, well, more than a tryst, yes. The bedroom.
Yes.
And it goes something like this: you've had violets from me before, i.e. chaste kisses. But now I will give you the whole rose bush. Let the north wind is gone.
That's her husband.
That's her husband. Let the south wind enter the bedroom,
Yes.
and spread its fragrance.
It's
the garden. Okay, it's not quite as explicit as that, but you can see how it works. You can decode the whole thing. That is a little gem, which works in, as many of these love letters do, some learned allusions. So actually it can probably be understood at two levels, really.
Well, I love
That's my
this
thing.
because we have so many examples and things like Fabio of students, right, who have enough Latin, and they're always the ones who are romancing people, especially when husbands are away. So it makes total sense that you would have a manual for how to do this, because there are letters in this Wheel of Venus that say, you know, here's what you do before the conquest, and here's what you could write to her after the conquest. Like, it's going to happen because these letters are so good.
Yes.
Absolutely. And they deal with the various awkwardnesses that arise. Like, one awkwardness is that she might now be pregnant, and you get a letter from a woman saying we have a problem, and the reply from the man saying no, we haven't. So there's the human life is in there.
Yes, and I just love the confidence with which this is written, because it's written in a way that these letters cannot fail you. And I think that's something that is so familiar to us as well when we're getting advice, maybe advice on dating and things like that. They're like, this is a fail-safe. It's totally going to work for you. And it's the same thing in this letter, this book of letters that you should be writing to people. I love it.
That's been the response of a fair few people, actually, to say, we thought things would be very different. Now, obviously, things are different in some way. I mean, we've discussed already that the mechanics of writing letters might be quite different. But of course, the human heart hasn't changed very much over the centuries. So there's so much to recognize in these medieval letters about ourselves.
Yes.
Although some things come up, of course, which aren't common now. You're probably not going to face a girlfriend who might be pressured into being a nun, or that, you know, or even proposition a nun, one would hope. And also arranged marriages. There's a rather sad little poem, a girl breaking off and saying, we're going to have to stop because I'm getting married and, you know, it can't go on. And so there were areas, of course, that don't exist now, but otherwise, yes, it doesn't change much, the actual emotion or the need to communicate.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right that a big subject of these love letters is also heartbreak and it's devastation, as much as it is these hilarious things about convincing someone not to be a nun. So you found this one in a manuscript. It is sort of a whole piece together, all of these things that are supposed to be used as models for love letters. Where are you finding other love letters, considering it's such an ephemeral thing? People are reusing parchment or maybe getting rid of them. Where are you finding love letters that aren't exemplars like this one?
So some of our finds were in curious places, often on fly leaves of manuscripts.
And they would be drafts, not the actual letters, and not provably, of course, actual letters, but they look like it, the Norfolk Abbot.
Yeah, we have this series of letters, really quite remarkable, from a Norfolk abbot, or could be a Suffolk abbot too, but anyway, an abbot in East Anglia, written to a nun called Margaret. You can see the love affair.
Hitting hitches. She hasn't turned up for a tryst, and he's rather cross. And of course, communications would be difficult. He's also very anxious this should not get out for obvious reasons. So there could be drafts. There could be actual missives, i.e. we've got the letters themselves. That is the case with a canoness from Remiremont. Her letters were kept by the man she was writing to, who was Pierre of Hagenbach, who was a general in the Burgundian army, and they were found with his letters when he died. So he'd obviously kept them. Whether he'd just forgotten about them, one doesn't know. But those are as near as you can get to actual examples. We know they were sent we know they were kept.
And we have a few examples of love letters also in what we're beginning to see in the 15th century is like these gentry collections, the correspondence of gentry families. Now, you have to look quite hard. That has to be said. We have to look quite hard to find the interesting letters, because mostly these letter collections are dull and boring unless you're interested in estate management and things like that. But in those collections, there's usually one, with any luck, two, three maybe even in the case of the ambre letters, love letters that you can find in these gentry collections. By that stage, these letters are written in English. And that also needs to be said. There's something that makes writing a letter in the medieval period quite different, because even if you are in England, and England is our main focus, you may well be writing them in a language that isn't actually your mother tongue. You might be writing them in French, which was deemed to be the polite language for so many centuries. So we're beginning to see some of those letters in these gentry collections in the 15th century, and we include some of those. And we also discuss them in a very long introduction.
Yes, there is a famous Valentine from Margaret Paston, which we do include, although we don't edit it, it's already been edited. And the Amber collection includes some poems, which are not always thought of as the letters, but they're in a letter collection, and they are plainly to someone, rather than just models and generic. There seems to be an actual situation going on. And that's rather an interesting one, because he does actually learn poetry as he's proceeding, as he starts off using a model, actually, an existing poem that was quite well known, and just adds a little postscript, and then adapts another French one, and then starts adapting and really refining and writing his own verse. So he sort of gets the trick as he's going along. But again, there's not that many, for obvious reasons, because it was confidential, of love letters that do survive, but enough to give you some notion. The drafts are slightly more common, and of course always arguable. Somebody could say, well, it's not an actual letter, it's just a fiction. And you can never completely disprove that, but there's usually telltale signs of something specific and not simply generic, but you can never be certain.
Yeah, in the case of the letters of the Norfolk abbot, for instance, there is some little detail, like it might say, this is in French, of course, I'm going to Essex, and that's been crossed out. And presumably the reason that's crossed out is that he changed his mind. So we are pretty confident that they are drafts of real love letters, and that really got us so interested in trying to find out, who this abbot may have been, who Margaret may have been, just giving the options, ruling quite a few options out, and ending, I'm sorry to say, with a great deal of uncertainty.
Yes.
But you get interested in the people.
For sure. And this is such an interesting collection too, because there is the added power dynamic, right? Where you see that the abbot's leaning on the nun saying, you're supposed to obey me, in ways that are kind of creepy, considering that this is supposed to be a love affair. And so, you get really invested in the story. What's happening? Absolutely. What's going to happen next?
It really is what we would call abusing your position.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And that is very disturbing to read. I will speak up on behalf of Margaret here, who I think really shows, we only, of course, know her replies from what the abbot writes, but we mustn't underestimate women. And we don't in this collection. We have a lot of letters by women themselves. Many people think that we don't have many letters from women, but there's a good number of letters written by women. We mustn't underestimate them, and we don't want to underestimate Margaret, who seems to have been quite capable of fending this guy off.
Yeah.
She did not turn up at King's Lynn, where she was expected. Is it King's Lynn? I think it was King's Lynn.
Yes. Yeah.
Somewhere in Norfolk, that is. And we can plot, as it were, these movements on the map. All these place names get mentioned, and that's really something that makes the letters, makes these seem to us like draft letters of actual letters rather than models, or indeed, jeu d'esprit.
Well, it's a tricky business when you think about it. If you're trying to set up a tryst back in the old days, there are no cell phones, so the people have to show up at the right place at the right time.
Yes.
and it doesn't always work out. Okay, so we're talking about an abbot and a nun here. What's your sense of how many letters people are able to get when they're behind the cloister walls and how much privacy they can expect there? Because this isn't the only collection of letters we have between people who are supposed to be in order.
Absolutely.
They used intermediaries a lot. This is, I think, a difference in sensibility, is we wouldn't want a third around. That they were used to that. They used the ladies used their ladies' maids or a confidant. The men often had a staff and they could send a messenger. So the ami, in the strict sense, the friend, was actually a very necessary element. And he's even in love allegories like Le Roman de la Rose, which has all sorts of abstractions that you need. Danger, off-putting pride, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Or welcome, but there is ami.
That is.
Ami is an essential.
That is the go-between.
Yeah.
I mean, in Troilus and Cressida, it's Pandarus. And actually, when I was young, there were also go-betweens. You had a little bit of right, because you wouldn't dare to speak to your lady, to your girl. It was a bit of paper that a friend had to deliver. Mm-hmm. So I realized that this book was necessary when my friends said, when I was teaching Troilus and Cressida, and I explained, why there was a need for Pandarus and why there was a need for approaching the lady in a letter, first of all. When you declare your love, you're putting a lot at risk and you need to control your emotions. So doing it in writing makes perfect sense. But my students said to me, oh no, we just text each other. So I thought, right, what we need, clearly there's a need for a book that explains this.
Yes, you're sending
it. And it was also a way, of course, of maintaining privacy a little, because it was difficult to meet in person, actually. You had to arrange that. You were women especially, very rarely alone. So you used intermediaries to arrange things so that people couldn't see you were communicating. The men, it was slightly easier for, because they had messengers who could travel. The women did use their servants, but they couldn't go very far. They might be able to go down to the marketplace. Juliet uses her nurse, if you remember.
Right.
So somebody who's in your confidence. So in a way, they accepted that there would always be a third or a fourth even. Whereas I think we would be unhappy with that, really. And I'm afraid often children were used as messengers as well, or as a kind of token chaperones, that there would be a little girl or a little boy around.
And we know the name of some of them from letters, because the letters might say, make sure that you can trust Hubert.
Yes.
He's a good man. You can trust what he says. So the letters sometimes make reference to the messenger, as in this very interesting love letter that Clare sends to George Seeley in the 15th century. So the Seeleys are a family dealing in wool and textiles, and they have a branch in Calais. And George Seeley is the man who looks after the Calais branch. And he obviously had a mistress there. He's far away from the eyes of the family, so it's a bit easier to have a bit on the side. Mm-hmm. And this was Clare, and Clare writes a letter to him that has been preserved, a love letter. And Clare also names the person who will deliver the letter, who is, I think,
Bartholomew.
And Bartholomew is a little boy that works for George Seeley. So,
probably,
yeah. Now, but you mentioned, Danièle, the whole religious situation, because this has interested readers of the book, that we have love letters from abbots, we have love letters from canonesses, from the canoness and Remiremont. But the religious life is also very diverse. So on the one hand, you can have, let's say, enclosed monks, right, who are not supposed to stray from their monastery, though they actually do, as we know from Chaucer. On the other hand, there are people like the canonesses of Remiremont, who didn't take religious vows, who had private lodgings. I think, Myra, in your book, you call it genteel accommodation. It was very pleasant being a canoness in Remiremont. If I were a woman in the 15th century, I would have wanted to be a canoness in Remiremont. Very pleasant. They could go traveling. They could go away for months if they wanted to. They could take husbands, then, of course, there would be an expectation that they would give up their lodgings at the abbey. So religious life is so very diverse, and relations between religious people are very diverse too, and sometimes very ambiguous. So you might have in the Surflingen letters, that's 15th century German now. The Surflingen was a Germany on the border with France and Switzerland. These nuns had friars who wrote letters to them. And it's hard to know what to make of them. They read like love letters.
But they had, it was almost a formal system of Gottfreundschaft. You partnered up with one of the friars. You became your, sounds like a euphemism, but one doesn't know how euphemistic it is. There was certainly room for more if they wanted, but it's impossible to tell. They may just have been friends. I mean, they needed friends and in the opposite sex, and they may just have partnered up in a fairly kind of innocent way, really. And it would be epistolary, the relationship, because strictly, and men weren't on the premises, but there was a little window you could communicate with the outside world. And one really doesn't know how far it was a game and how far it was real. It's difficult. Remember also that the expectations of people's commitment to the religious life was different. Is we would now assume that anyone who was a nun or a monk was strictly celibate and wasn't going to partner up. They were very used to people who were in the religious life for career reasons. For women, sometimes there was no other route for a respectable. So they were quite used to people whose commitment would be lukewarm, to say the least, and they probably wouldn't find it as shocking as we do that there were affairs going on between nuns and abbots, although it shouldn't have done, of course.
Yeah, I get that sense also from Chaucer. You know, you think of Don John in the Shipman's Tale, these monks who are winking at the women, Jankin, you know, there's all these characters in Chaucer, and you don't get the sense of it being a scandal as much as it might seem now.
Well, it's interesting what the two of you are bringing up in that we know that the courtly love tradition is all about flirting, and you can flirt really, really far and still have plausible deniability. And I think this is such a big part of the culture that may be different from today, because today we're like, we really want to be clear in our text. That's why we have our emojis, to make sure that we're not misunderstood. But here, there's so much room for it. And yes, when you're looking at these correspondences, you're like, is something going on or not? And
yes,
do you find this in most letters that you're not quite sure? Or is this kind of just something that you see in really formalized letters?
I think we often see this ambiguity. And the ambiguity is very helpful. When you are declaring your feelings to someone, this deniability is also very useful. Did you say it or did you not say it? Did you mean anything or did you not mean anything? So, yeah, I think certainly in the case of these Surflingen letters that we just mentioned now, these letters, I find it simply impossible to decide whether these are real love letters or whether we're dealing with platonic love. And what makes it even more confusing is that these letters cite real love letters, although when I say real love letters, I mean letters from a fictional source. So the friars writing to the nuns are sometimes using as a basis of their letters from a literary text that clearly are love letters. So this makes it even harder to know what you're dealing with. Certainly the reformers, and the reason we have these letters is that the reformers got hold of them and they were scandalized by it. So certainly the reformers would have taken a dim view of these letters and thought that they certainly thought that they transgressed the boundary of what was acceptable. But
they had their own agenda, of course, for putting as bad a construction on it as they could. But that particular instance is very hard. It's one of the friars using a letter from a literary text, but it is a love letter. It's Euryalus and Lucrece, which was a very famous love story, as popular as Troilus and Crusade in its day. And he's taken that and simply transcribed it and sent it. Now, in the original, it certainly is a love letter. But the terms love and respect and this kind of thing are, of course, open to interpretation. You could say it was simply an expression of devotion and friendship. There was always that margin, and it is sometimes difficult to tell letters of what were called friendship. I mean, friendship was expressed in the most flowery terms between men and women, or between women and between men, in ways that to us would sound very suggestive. But it was simply meant to be passionate, tender, loving. And of course, that is useful for what you're calling deniability as well. That if the letter was discovered, you could say, well, he's simply devoted to me, or, it's friendship. You can't always tell. Sometimes you can, very plainly. I mean, some of the Paston letters, one of the girls was having an affair with, I think it was an estate, somebody who worked on the estate. Mm-hmm. And they did eventually get married. But of course, it was not popular with her relatives. And there we know that this is a love affair. And they run into all sorts of difficulties. I mean, he actually says somebody came with a letter that claimed from you, but he didn't have a token. And it's very difficult for them to find trustworthy messengers.
Well, you've gone in the direction I was hoping to head in, where sometimes when you're looking at these letters and they are between men and men, women and women, and you're like, are they just roommates? Because this is a super important part of history, but something that is very hard to untangle. So when you're dealing with these letters, do you have rules that you follow personally that help you decide which category we should put this in? Or is it kind of just something that you decide on a case-by-case basis?
One of the things I think we think about when we decide, is this a model love letter, or is this just a poem, or is this a love letter that was a draft or actually sent, would be circumstantial detail. As soon as names get mentioned, for example, that is actually itself quite revealing. Places, of course, place names would be very revealing. You're clearly not dealing with a model if you give that amount of detail. That would be a clue.
On the other hand, the absence of them is not, because they did avoid any identifying details deliberately. We've got a correspondence between the poet Machaut and a girlfriend called Perron. We think her name was Perron. These are real, but they very carefully avoid any name. My brother, your sister. I think one of the servants has a nickname who does get mentioned. And of course, famous people, Duke John or something. But they very carefully avoid any personal names or places. And some of the guidebooks did advise that. Don't give anything that might identify you, in case they're intercepted.
That could be, yes. The letter could be intercepted and you wouldn't want the name mentioned. And the canoness of Remiremont also doesn't name herself in it. She kind of says, well, you know from who this is. Yeah. Or she has a nickname.
She has a nickname, Guyrie, which some people say may be an abbreviation of Margaret, but I suspect is a kind of pet name between them or something.
So maybe what Danièle says, that actually you have to do it on a case-by-case basis, is probably the way. And then you're dealing still with the kind of, balance of probabilities. We don't always know. We just have to accept that.
Well, this leads me to the question, because we are getting to the end of our time. Which ones, you've done a whole collection of them, which ones are your favorites? Because you just love the story and maybe you want the story to be something. Which ones are your favorites in your collection?
Eloise would always be my favorite because she writes so well and so powerfully. The story is well known, and by the way, there is no doubt there. It's a very clear case. I think I might find Boncompagno.
Well, I love Boncompagno, I think his model letters are just brilliant. They're witty, they're very accepting, I think, of the kinds of situations that people will find themselves in and that you will find yourself in. And he has a letter for all occasions. I was gripped by the Norfolk abbot too. I'm sorry, I don't have favorites because also, the letters we have here are so different. We have model letters, we have real letters or drafts of real letters. So it's hard to name a favorite, but I got very into the Norfolk abbot and trying to work out who he was. And it's a bit like a detective, really, who done it? Who is this guy? Abusing his position of authority. And if he was an abbot, I mean, we may still be able to nail him down. I've not given up all hope. Something might come to light.
Yes, we're neither of us professional historians, so we sort of shelved that one, but there are certainly avenues we haven't yet explored for trying to find out who he is. The canoness, I'm quite pleased, is probably not recoverable. All sorts of historians have attempted to find out who she was. And I'm rather pleased they have failed. She will retain her privacy, really. But she tells us enough about herself and her situation so that you can imagine. She had a father, she had a sister, and so on. And we do know who her lover was. And I'm not particularly anxious to unearth there. I don't think who she is, but the Norfolk abbot, it would be interesting. Yeah.
And there's also other questions that might decide what your favorite one is, because sometimes there's questions of literary value, which you like best as a poem. And that's not always not going to be the same answer. But I like some of the ones that are really quite bad poetry. So Humphrey Newton, who is a Cheshire gentleman in the early 16th century, has a couple of letters where he provides a little circumstantial detail that allows the addressee to know that he is the person who she saw. So he might say something in this letter like, and I saw you with this old woman. Remember, you were just about to go into church and you talked to her there and you cast your eye on me then. You remember? This kind of stuff I find interesting. I don't think that is great poetry.
No, it's quite witty. But by the way, that probably is a fictional situation. I mean, it may not be. And it's a naughty poem, really, because it's playing with confidentiality, but gives the game away completely, really. But yes, it is a very engaging piece. Yeah.
For literary merit, it's Eloise that Myra was hugely impressed with the letters of Abelard, the letters of Heloise in particular. And they are really impressive. And what comes across in these letters is I think it's just the controlled emotion in them. You feel both the emotion. She is still in love with Abelard. She is in the convent not because of God. She is in the convent because he asked her to. She is not thinking about God. She is thinking about him. This is so powerful, but it's also written in such fine Latin.
Yeah.
It's just hugely impressive. It's so impressive. By the way, it's also an argument why we think that the letters that are sometimes thought to be by Eloise, found in a much later collection, are not, we think, by Eloise, who has this impressive quality in her writing. So if you want literary merit, you got Eloise.
Well, I love this because it just goes to show that your book has something for everyone, for the romantics, for the detectives, for the people who love amazing grammar and composition. It's got it all, which is why I enjoyed it so much. So thank you so much for coming on and telling us all about it. I hope people will run out and dive into these romantic letters from the Middle Ages. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having us, Danielle.
To find out more about Myra and Ad's work, you can visit their faculty pages at the University of Bristol. Their new book is Medieval Love Letters, a Critical Anthology. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's going on, Peter?
Hey. So, one of the key battles of the Wars of the Roses may not have even happened at all.
What?
I know. This is really interesting research. Two historians, Paul Dawson and David Grummett, and they take a look at the Battle of Wakefield. And this is the one that takes place on December 30th, 1460, or so it's supposed to have happened. Mm-hmm. And the traditional story has, Richard, Duke of York, leading his forces out of Sandal Castle, and he just get crushed by the Lancastrians.
Right.
Now, what Paul and David are arguing is basically that story is largely made up by two historians long after the fact.
That's big news.
Indeed. And so they look at the kind of earliest sources, like stuff that came out like in 1461. And they point to a very, very different story where Duke Richard and some of his followers are like leaving Wakefield the day before. And they wind up getting ambushed and murdered out on the street.
Oh, I mean, I'm working on the time earlier in that century where this is happening a lot in France, but getting ambushed and murdered is very different from losing a battle.
Yeah. So I think this is going to rewrite history books.
Everyone needs to check out this article and see what it says, because huge if true.
Yeah, indeed. So yeah, it's a fascinating article. The article's open access. So check out our piece on that and then check out the article for all the details.
Mm-hmm.
So we have that. Plus we have a story from Finland where they examined the remains of two people from the 12th century. They were buried 50 kilometers apart. Yet DNA analysis found out they were brother and sister.
Oh, I wonder what happened there.
I know, it's a kind of a cute little story. So they don't know anything about these two except that they are brother and sister. So there's some nice details on the site. Plus we have Laura Chevalier on 5 upcoming medieval movies that you might want to see.
Mm-hmm.
And Donald Ostrowski on the conversion of Vladimir the Great.
Well, this all sounds amazing. Lots of new stuff coming out, lots of new stuff to see. So thanks, Peter, for coming by and telling us all about it.
Thanks.
Well, we're halfway through my mini-series for Dan Jones's This Is History podcast, and things are getting real in the Kingdom of France. We've already heard about King Charles's homicidal break with reality and a little oopsie of a party, thanks to his brother, Louis of Orleans. This week, the Wheel of Fortune is about to spin wildly again. To find out what happens next, check out This Is History Presents The Glass King. For everything from love letters to iron fetters, follow medievalist.net on Instagram at medievalistnet or Blue Sky at medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulskie, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5 Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores. Our music is by Christian Overton. Thanks for listening, and have yourself a lovely day.